So I have another quick one-part series showing you how I built this bed canopy. So this is basically going to be mounted above someone's bed, and the customer is going to add all the drapery that's going to come off the bottom of the bed. Like I said, this is going to be a quick one-part series, and I apologize for a couple times in the video, but I'm going to in the introduction as well. As I mentioned in the last video, I had an intern for 5 weeks this summer. Today was actually his last day. So especially on this build, we were focusing more on learning, not necessarily YouTube. So I didn't get a lot of the process of the build. So there's a lot more pointing at stuff and talking about it throughout the video versus showing how I did it. But like I said, today was his last day. So this will be the last video that's affected with camera angles and not getting the same sort of footage I usually get. But projects like this I call facade furniture, because all that really matters is what the front of it looks like, because you're never going to see the back of it. So it's not my most favorite type of furniture to make, mainly because no one wants to spend a ton of money on something they're never going to see. So a lot of what's holding this together is just regular 2x4 construction, and it's not necessarily pretty to look at. So when it's mounted and in place, it will look amazing, but like I said, it's not my most favorite type of furniture to make. This customer I've made stuff for in the past, and she's awesome in the sense that she prefers to paint her own stuff to save some money. So this piece is actually pretty much finished. I just have a little bit of sanding to do, but that's stuff that on camera you won't really notice the difference. So she's also cool in the sense that she usually does send me photos of the finished pieces. So if she does, I'll update the thumbnail on YouTube. So I started off this project by building the frame, which I was building the corners out of 2x6s because I needed that width in order to get the corner. So I drew out a corner, which is just a 45 with a curve on the front because this piece is going to be curved, and then I just cut a 2x6 down into length measurements. So I'm cutting the miters on my table saw because I do have a miter attachment for that saw, so it gives me a nice clean cut. So then you could see I could just line up my marks and cut all 4 of these pieces on the table saw. I do round over those corners on a sander, but I did not film that. So then I decided to lap joint this entire frame together so that it's the most structural sound piece I can get. So I marked out where I wanted these laps to go, and I cut laps with the radial arm saw. It's very easy to cut up a stop, raise the blade. This is pine, so the kerf material removes very easily. Since it's on 2 sides and one side now has a curve on it, you could see I had to set up a stop on both sides of the saw blade. Once I put this back on the table, I decided that this wasn't going to be enough material for the laps, so I ended up adjusting it and then cutting it again. I always like to show stuff like this because in woodworking, sometimes with these videos you show all the good parts, but a lot of the times with these processes, especially something like this, I've never made a piece of furniture exactly like this before. There's going to be a little bit of trial and error. But you can see because this still has a straight edge on it, I could once again easily cut an extension on those laps for my material to fit in. And this will just give me more of a gluing surface for those corners. So then for all of the straightaways, I was using the same material, 2x6. I rip one side as square as a 2x6 is going to get, and then I rip this into pieces. I believe this was 2.5 chunks I ripped this 2x6 into. So here's just ripping it down the middle. The quality of lumber has been extremely poor since COVID. There's really nothing anyone can do about it. These 2x6s are usually a fairly good grade of lumber around where I live, but recently they've just been horrible. And then this is just a small portion that's going to go for the back, which I'm now cutting down as well. So then I set up what looks to be a fairly intricate jig on my radial arm saw, but it took all of 5 minutes to put together, and that just gives me the angle I need for the sides. You can see I drew it out in order to fit into the corners. So one of those stops will give me the angle, the other one is a stop, so I cut exactly the depth correctly on each one. Same process, I could go through and cut all of these. It's going to be 2 sections, and then there's going to be studs in between them in order to make the frame. So unfortunately for this, I did have to move this to the other side of the fence as well, mirror the jig in order to cut all my pieces. But you can see now how that corner is going to fit into my straightaways. So I have a straightaway, a long length connecting the 2 corners, and then a piece shooting off the back side, and that creates the depth. So I could just glue these together and clamp them, and you could see now with all of this gluing surface how sturdy these corners are going to be on this piece. So that's the long straightaway, and then the back piece, which is about a little less than 18 inches is the depth she wanted for this. So I was editing this video and I realized I never took any final photos of the interior frame. So once again, I apologize, but this is just going to be an added clip without seeing how I did it. So you saw the glue up of the corners, so I knew these were going to be, I believe, 18 inches, and then the straightaway. So I had 2 of those. And then all we did was go through, and this is also about 18 inches tall, but I left a space so I could cut the curve. So these were about 1 foot. And then we just went through, and just like you would build a wall, these would acting as studs, screwed them in from the top and the bottom, and that's how I got the interior frame. Everything's just attached to it. Since plywood's fairly dimensionally stable, I just screwed it to the piece, no glue. The top is also screwed in the front and the bottom with elongated holes so that this can move. But you can see the spray foam worked really well. The corners are super solid. But since they're somewhat unsightly, I'll probably put a cheap piece of plywood, birch veneer ply, covering these corners as well. But that is basically how the frame looks. So then for bending the plywood, I've tried bending plywood before and I haven't had a lot of success, at least on bigger curves like this. But I saw a video online that shows putting cross-cut curves once you make your vertical curve cuts as well, and that seemed to work in the video and it worked in real life. So you can see I just put a series of curves through. I go through every single layer of ply all the way up to the veneer. Now the cross cuts I used, as you can see, a saw for that, and I did not realize this at the time, because I just have a bunch of older blades in the saw, so I thought that's why it was smoking, but I actually had it in there backwards, so it was cutting off a bunch of the material. I also like to include stuff like that. We all make stupid mistakes in the shop, and that was mine. I was still able to get the curve out of it. As you can see, I used gravity to help me out, so I just laid that curve on my corner, and gravity kind of forced that plywood down. Use the water just to give it a little more pliability, and then I could just clamp the whole piece to the frame. This plywood curved really well around these outer corners. So for the second one, I decided to make those cross cuts on the table saw, and that worked out a lot better. I didn't have any tear out. I was already planning on filling the curves with material to make them more stable, so it wasn't really that big of a deal that I had some blowout on the original. But I have the intern in the shop most of the week, so in real life a lot of these shop practices I wait for the saw to stop, whereas if he wasn't there I would have probably taken it off while it was still running. If you want to regain some good shop safety, get a young intern, because you want to show them proper technique. So then, like I said, this piece was longer than 8 feet, so I made the 2 curved sections. I couldn't make it in one piece, and then I just cut the middle out and attached it with brads. I eventually attached the whole thing with screws in the back as well. For the kerf, I decided to fill it with spray foam, and this actually worked really well. I could spray some foam, and then I used a piece of cordboard to just fill it in the gaps. This set up really nicely, and made it super solid, those corners. So I apologize, I did not get footage of drawing or cutting out this curve, but I'm going to show you how I did it. So with all photos off the internet, I usually create a scale and I could transfer that scale to the real life project. It just makes life a lot easier. So this photo, it happened to be 4 inches across, so I was able to easily cut this up into 4 quadrants. So then I could, with 4 quadrants, that means each one of these is 1 inch. So then I could transfer this to the actual piece. I could cut the front up into 4 quadrants. You can see it's a little off center, but then I could transfer these curves into those quadrants. So the math just worked out perfectly that the total length of this whole piece around the curve is 101, but the front of it is 80. 80 is extremely easily divisible by 4, so I knew I had 20-inch quadrants in real life. So you can kind of see my original marks. I have center, and then I have, you can see it right there was 1 quadrant, and the other quadrant was there. And then looking at the picture, I could just transfer those curves. Now this line right here is where the 2x4 is, so I didn't want to go past that mark. But then I just took a bendable ruler, I lined it up with my marks, I bent it and drew a straight line. That's basically how I got all these based off the quadrant. So then, like I said, this is just how I got those curves. I had marks on my quadrants of where I wanted the curve to start and end. I just used a ruler to create the curve, and then I cut it out with a jigsaw. And then I was able to go through and veneer the whole edge. For the corners, I had to veneer it in pieces, but it was only one extra piece I had to cut for the corners, because the corner's pretty wide, so I was able to cover most of the material. So once again, another fill-in clip. I didn't film putting together the top. The top was basically 2 pieces, 3/4 inch by, I want to say, 8-inch premium grade pine. This is actually a nice grade of pine that the Lowe's sells. Since this is going to be painted, it was the cheapest option that didn't have a lot of knots. That's what makes it premium. It's usually a nicer grade of yellow pine versus white pine. It doesn't have any knots. So all I did was take those 2 boards. If you buy them from Lowe's, they're a little more expensive because they're already faced and jointed, but it saves me the time of having to do it myself, so the price actually usually kind of works out. I just glued them together, and then I rough cut out the shape, but then after I added the molding, I went back and sanded it to the edge of the molding to match the photo, and then rounded over the edge. So to get the moldings on this piece, I originally was going to steam bend these, but the problem with steam bending molding is that moldings, usually kiln dried, are already close to dry, and putting that in a steamer, sometimes it will crack. Steaming works best when the lumber's still green or hasn't been kiln dried. So I knew you could bend PVC by heating it up, so this was a trial on some crown molding around the top, and it actually worked out really well. The other side I bent first, and it went a little better. I was a little distracted with this one, so I got the heater a little too close, and you could see it was burning it a little bit. But if you gradually heat up this PVC, you can bend it around the curve. The crown was harder to bend because you're trying to get it to fit on two planes, the top and the bottom. But it stays malleable for quite a while after you bend it, and it's not super hot. So I was able to bend it and then kind of shape it, and once it's dry you can sand it. So I was able to sand a little bit of the curve and get a pretty good match. For this molding down here, it was a little bit easier because I'm just going around the curve. You could see I'm just heating it up. It's bending really nicely. The PVC of the molding, it's not PVC, it's plastic. It wants to change a little bit, but for the most part it pretty much keeps its shape. You could push it into place a little bit. It doesn't stay hot for long. Another part I did not film was making the French cleat for the installation on this. I do not believe I'm installing this. I know I'm not painting it, so I do not believe I'm installing it as well. But I basically just took a 2x4, I made a 45 cut somewhat in the middle. The part that's being attached to the wall, you want to have enough space here to attach screws, which is why this one's a little bigger. So this one will get attached to the wall with the angle facing the wall. So this part will get screwed into the wall. Then this will get screwed into the back side of the piece, like this, and then they could fit on each other. So I just have this piece mounted on the back side, and then you could see how the French cleat will work holding this in place. This is just a photo of the original inspiration photo the customer sent me, and then a bunch of photos of just about the finished piece. You could see the molding and everything is on there now, and just about ready for final sanding, and then she could come pick it up.